On the rooftop pool of Miami's most prestigious hotel, Amelia Langford believed the investor party was just another exhausting night of smiling through exhaustion and quiet calculation. But when three men quietly sealed off the exits, pressed her back toward the water's edge, and whispered her company already belonged to them, no one in the crowd dared move a single step. No one except Mason Carter, the lifeguard everyone dismissed as invisible, still standing beneath the cold blue light with his arms folded and his eyes perfectly calm. That single mistake would leave the entire rooftop in stunned, breathless silence. If you love stories where the person everyone overlooks becomes the last line of defense, stay until the very end. The hotel rose 30 stories above Biscayne Bay, its glass face catching the last orange light of evening until the whole building seemed to burn, quietly from within. On the rooftop, the infinity pool stretched toward the horizon as though it meant to spill straight into the ocean, and waiters moved between the lounge chairs with trays of champagne balanced like offerings. This was where Miami's wealthiest gathered when they wanted to be seen agreeing to things they had already decided in private, and tonight the occasion was an investor gala hosted by Langford Holdings, a firm that had spent a decade building itself into something too large to ignore. Amelia Langford stood near the edge of the terrace in a pale blue dress that matched the pool lights, and from a distance she looked exactly like what the room expected her to be, composed, untouchable, born into confidence rather than having built it herself. Only those who worked closest to her knew how much of that composure was armor. She had inherited the company from a father who trusted numbers more than people, and she had spent years proving that a woman could run it without apology. Success had made her powerful, it had also made her profoundly alone, and she had learned to treat that loneliness the way she treated bad quarterly earnings, as something to be managed and never mentioned aloud. Guests drifted around her with the particular hunger of people who wanted proximity to money, laughing too quickly at things that were not funny, angling their bodies toward cameras and toward her. She smiled back with practiced warmth, gave brief answers to questions about growth projections, and kept one eye always on the clock, counting down the hours until she could return to her penthouse and stop performing. Near the far end of the pool, close to where the water lapped gently against imported stone, a man in a red lifeguard uniform sat in an elevated chair that most of the guests had already forgotten was occupied. Mason Carter was tall and quiet, with the kind of stillness that made people either overlook him completely or feel faintly uneasy, without knowing why. He had worked at the hotel for 8 months, arriving early, leaving late, and speaking only when spoken to. To the guests drifting past him in designer heels, he was furniture, a necessary safety fixture required by insurance policy rather than a person with a name. Mason did not mind being invisible. Invisibility, he had learned, was often safer than being seen. He had a daughter waiting for him at home, with a neighbor who watched her most evenings, and every dollar earned on this rooftop went toward rent, toward small shoes that never seemed to fit for long, toward a life built carefully out of ordinary things. He wore his lifeguard uniform the way another man might wear a uniform from a very different kind of service, with quiet discipline and no need for anyone to notice. What none of the laughing guests understood, and what Amelia herself would not understand for several more hours, was that Mason's eyes never actually stopped working. While he appeared to watch only the water, he was cataloging the room the way he had once been trained to catalog a room, noting exits, counting unfamiliar faces, registering the small tension in a jaw or the wrong kind of glance passed between strangers. It was a habit he could not turn off even after years of trying, and on this particular evening, that habit would matter more than anyone at the party could have imagined. The sun continued its slow collapse into the bay, staining the pool a deeper gold, and the party swelled toward its loudest hour. Amelia raised her glass for a toast she did not feel, laughed at a joke she did not find amusing, and glanced, without quite knowing why, toward the quiet man in red sitting at the water's edge. For a moment their eyes met. Neither of them looked away first, and then the moment passed, swallowed by the noise of 200 people determined to be impressed by each other. What the guests did not know, and what Amelia carried like a stone in her chest all evening, was that Langford Holdings stood closer to collapse than any of them realized. A hostile group of shareholders had spent months quietly buying influence, and whispers had reached her that a vote was coming, one that could strip her of control over the company her father had built and she had spent her whole adult life defending. She had come to this party not to celebrate but to perform strength, because in her world, the appearance of confidence was sometimes the only thing standing between survival and ruin. Connor Blake moved through the crowd with the easy authority of a man who had earned his position, though in truth Connor had earned very little of anything, honestly. As the hotel's head of security for the evening's private event, he answered directly to Amelia and had done so for nearly 3 years, long enough that she trusted him without examining that trust too closely. He smiled at her from across the terrace and lifted his glass in a small salute. She returned the gesture, unaware that Connor had spent the previous week meeting quietly with men whose names appeared nowhere on any guest list. 3 of those men arrived separately, spaced 20 minutes apart, each presenting invitations that looked correct because Connor himself had arranged for them to look correct. Jason Vale came first, broad-shouldered and soft-spoken, introducing himself to nearby guests as a private equity partner from Chicago. Ryan Cross followed, sharper-featured and quicker to laugh, claiming ties to a venture fund that did not exist beyond a website built the week before. Hunter Reed arrived last, saying little, watching everything, the kind of man who preferred to let others talk while he studied the room. From his chair at the pool's edge, Mason noticed them within minutes of each arrival, though he could not yet have explained why. It was not their clothing, which was expensive and unremarkable. It was the way they positioned themselves, always with a clear line of sight to Amelia, always near an exit, rarely speaking to each other directly but frequently checking one another's location with brief, practiced glances. Mason had spent enough years reading rooms full of people who wanted to hurt someone to recognize the shape of it. Even now, dressed up in tailored suits and rooftop champagne, he told himself it was not his concern. He was a lifeguard, not a soldier, and the life he had built for his daughter depended on staying exactly that small and unremarkable. But some instincts did not retire simply because a man wanted them to, and Mason found himself tracking the 3 strangers the same way he tracked a swimmer drifting too far from the shallow end, calmly, without alarm but without looking away either. Amelia felt the weight of the evening pressing on her shoulders as she moved from one cluster of investors to another, answering the same reassurances about the company's stability that she was no longer certain she believed herself. She noticed the 3 new faces eventually, the way any careful executive notices unfamiliar money in the room, but Connor had vouched for their credentials personally, and she had 100 other fires to manage. No one, not even the woman who had spent her whole life training herself to see danger before it arrived, imagined that danger tonight would come dressed as an investor and escorted in by the very man paid to keep her safe. Amelia's phone buzzed twice in her clutch, both messages from her general counsel warning that 2 more shareholders had shifted their support toward the opposing faction ahead of the coming vote. She silenced the screen without reading further, unwilling to let her expression betray the panic building quietly beneath her composure. A decade of practice had taught her to compartmentalize crisis, to smile through one disaster while privately dismantling another, and tonight demanded every ounce of that discipline at once. She excused herself toward the bar for a moment alone, needing 30 seconds where no one required anything of her. The first open cruelty of the evening came from a guest named Preston Hall, a junior partner at one of the smaller investment firms who had drunk enough champagne to mistake volume for wit. He wandered too close to the shallow end, nearly stumbled over a lounge chair, and when Mason rose to steady him out of habit rather than necessity, Preston shoved his hand away and laughed loudly enough for a dozen heads to turn. "Careful," Preston said, loud enough for the whole terrace to hear. "Some of us actually matter to this company. You just clean the water, right? Try not to touch the guests." A ripple of laughter followed, thin and uncomfortable but present nonetheless, the kind of laughter people offer when they want to seem amused rather than embarrassed for someone else. Mason said nothing. He returned to his chair without a flicker of expression crossing his face, his hands folded calmly in his lap as though the words had passed through him without leaving a mark. Amelia stood only a few feet away and heard every word. In another version of the evening, one with fewer variables weighing on her mind, she might have stepped in immediately, might have reminded Preston that basic decency cost nothing and that a hotel employee deserved the same respect as anyone drinking on her company's tab. Instead, exhausted and distracted by the vote she could not stop thinking about, She offered only a brief, tight smile toward Mason, a silent and inadequate acknowledgement. Before turning back to the conversation Preston had interrupted, Mason did not need her defense. He had spent years developing an unshakable indifference to the opinions of men who mistook money for character, and Preston Hall barely registered as more than background noise. What mattered to him was the pool, the guests near the edge, the three strangers still circling at the terrace's far corner. He noted, almost without meaning to, that when a champagne flute slipped from a passing waiter's tray and shattered near his chair, his hand had already caught the second glass beside it before the first one hit the ground. A reflex too fast and too precise for an ordinary lifeguard. Only one person seemed to notice. Hunter Reed, standing near the bar with a drink he had not touched, watched the small moment with narrowed eyes, filing it away the way a professional files away any detail that does not fit the picture he expected. He said nothing to Jason or Ryan, not yet, but something in his posture shifted, a fraction more caution entering a plan that had, until that instant, accounted for every obstacle except the quiet man in red sitting at the water's edge. Amelia caught herself glancing toward Mason more than once in the following minutes, unsettled by something she could not name. It was not sympathy exactly, though she felt that too. It was closer to recognition, the sense of encountering someone who carried himself with more restraint than the situation demanded, the way soldiers sometimes did, or people who had survived things they no longer discussed. She dismissed the thought as quickly as it arrived. She had a company to save and a party to survive, and she told herself there was no time tonight to wonder about the private history of a hotel. Lifeguard. By the time the string quartet finished its third set and the waitstaff began circulating dessert trays, the party had thinned just enough for Jason, Ryan, and Hunter to begin the slow, deliberate work of separating Amelia from the crowd. It was done so gently that no observer would have called it anything but conversation. Jason approached first, praising her father's legacy with practiced sincerity, guiding her by inches toward the terrace's quieter corner near the pool's deep end. Ryan joined moments later, laughing warmly, positioning himself just behind her right shoulder in a way that closed off her easiest path back, toward the crowd. Connor watched this unfold from near the bar and made his move with the calm efficiency of a man executing a plan rehearsed many times before. He approached the two security guards stationed nearest the terrace exit and informed them, in a tone that invited no argument, that additional coverage was needed downstairs for a delivery entrance that had apparently triggered an alarm. Neither guard questioned their supervisor. Within minutes, the terrace's only trained security presence had walked away entirely, leaving behind 200 wealthy guests and no one whose job it was to notice danger. The quartet's music swelled into a livelier piece just as the side door leading to the service stairwell clicked shut and locked from within, a detail no one but Hunter Reed, who had done the locking, would have known to look for. The volume of celebration on the rooftop rose to cover any smaller sound that might otherwise have carried laughter and clinking glass, forming a wall of noise thick enough to swallow anything happening at its edges. Amelia felt it before she understood it, the particular instinct that told her the space around her had changed shape. She glanced left and found Ryan closer than comfortable. She glanced right and found Jason blocking the most direct route back toward the open terrace. Hunter appeared behind her a moment later, unhurried, his hands in his pockets, his expression pleasant in a way that did not reach his eyes. She kept her voice light as she tried to excuse herself toward the bar and found, for the first time all evening, that no path opened easily in response. From his chair at the water's edge, Mason watched the shape of the crowd shift with the same quiet attention he gave to a swimmer's stroke growing tired. He noticed the empty security post before most people would have noticed the guards missing at all. He noticed the door that had clicked shut a beat too deliberately to be accidental. He noticed, most of all, the three men now standing in a loose but unmistakable triangle around Amelia Langford, close enough to touch her, positioned exactly the way men positioned themselves when they intended for someone not to leave. He rose from his chair slowly without urgency in his movements, the same unhurried pace he might use walking toward a child who had wandered too near the deep end. No one on the rooftop paid him any attention. That, he understood immediately, was precisely the mistake that was about to cost three men everything. As he crossed the tile, Mason ran through the same mental checklist that had once kept him alive in far more dangerous rooms than this one, counting distances, weighing angles, deciding in advance which man would need to be neutralized first and which could wait. He had promised himself years ago that this part of him would stay dormant forever, folded away like a uniform he no longer wore. Yet here it rose again, unbidden but unmistakably intact, and he did not fight it. Some instincts, he understood now, were never truly retired. They simply waited for a reason good enough to justify themselves again. Jason Vale leaned close enough that Amelia could smell the whiskey on his breath, and his voice, when it came, had lost every trace of the charm he had shown minutes earlier. "You're going to sign the transfer papers tonight," he said quietly. "The ones sitting in your own office safe. We know they're there. We know the code. Make this simple for everyone, Miss Langford, and no one has to remember this evening as anything but a party." Amelia's mind raced even as her face remained carefully still. A skill honed across a decade of boardroom negotiations where showing fear was the fastest way to lose everything. "You're making a serious mistake," she said, keeping her voice low enough that the guests laughing 30 feet away would never suspect anything was wrong. "There are 200 witnesses on this rooftop. 200 witnesses who are very drunk," Ryan said with a small, "and very far away." He shifted closer, and Hunter, silent until now, reached out and closed his fingers around her wrist, not violently, but with enough pressure to make clear that gentleness was a courtesy he could withdraw at any moment. "Walk with us to the elevator," Hunter said quietly. "We've already taken care of the cameras on this floor." Nearby, Preston Hall glanced over, registered something wrong in the tightness of Amelia's shoulders, and looked away just as quickly, telling himself it was none of his concern. Two other guests noticed the odd cluster of bodies near the pool's edge and chose, with the particular cowardice of people who did not wish to become involved in whatever this was, to drift toward the bar instead. Connor stood near the terrace entrance, watching the entire scene with his arms folded, offering nothing, intervening in nothing, exactly as he had been paid not to. Amelia felt her back come within inches of the low glass barrier separating the terrace from the pool's edge, felt the cold mist rising off the water behind her, and understood with sudden clarity that these men had planned every detail of this moment, down to the exact spot where the crowd's sightline would fail her. Her heart hammered, though her voice, when she spoke again, remained level. "This company survives me," she said. "It has for 10 years. It will survive whatever this is, too." "Not tonight," Jason said softly, and reached for the small tablet in his jacket pocket, ready to have her thumbprint verify a transfer she had never agreed to. It was in that exact instant, with Hunter's grip tightening and Ryan closing the last gap in the triangle around her, that a calm voice spoke from just behind Jason's shoulder, unhurried, almost gentle, the same tone Mason Carter used when telling a swimmer it was time to come back toward shore. "Let go of her," he said. Now all three men turned, and all three, in the half-second before everything changed, laughed. "The lifeguard," Ryan said, grinning at Jason as though the two of them shared a private joke too obvious to explain. "This is the part where the pool boy saves the day, is it?" Hunter did not laugh with them. Something in the way Mason stood, weight balanced evenly, hands loose and open at his sides rather than clenched into the fists an untrained man would have made, told him this was not a moment to underestimate. He opened his mouth to warn the others, but the warning came a fraction of a second too late. Mason moved first, and he moved the way water moves when a dam finally gives way, all at once and without hesitation. His hand closed around Jason's wrist before the tablet ever left his pocket, twisting it in a motion so economical it looked almost gentle, and Jason folded to his knees with a sound of surprised pain, the tablet clattering uselessly against the tile. Ryan lunged toward Mason's exposed side, and Mason pivoted half a step, using Ryan's own momentum to send him stumbling sideways, away from the pool's edge rather than toward it, a small mercy delivered with total precision. Hunter released Amelia's wrist and came at Mason directly, throwing a punch aimed at his jaw with the practiced speed of a man who had trained for exactly this kind of confrontation. Mason ducked beneath it, drove his shoulder into Hunter's chest, and used the wet tile beneath them to his advantage, letting Hunter's own weight carry him down onto the ground, hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. The entire exchange, from Mason's first step to Hunter's back hitting the terrace floor, lasted perhaps 6 seconds, though to Amelia, standing frozen at the pool's edge, it felt as though time itself had briefly stopped moving. The music from the quartet faltered and died as musicians noticed the commotion. Conversations near the terrace's edge fell away in a widening circle of silence, guests turning to see three well-dressed men on the ground and a lifeguard standing calmly above them, his uniform barely disturbed, his breathing steady, as though he had done nothing more strenuous than pull a tired child from the shallow end. Amelia stood very still, one hand pressed against her own chest where her heart still hammered, staring at Mason as though seeing him for the first time in 8 months of walking past his chair, without a second glance. He turned to her immediately, his expression softening from the flat, focused calm of a moment ago into something gentler. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear it clearly. She shook her head, unable yet to form words. Behind them, Connor Blake had gone pale, his earlier composure cracking as he realized in real time that whatever plan he had spent weeks assembling had just collapsed in under 10 seconds because of a man in a red uniform that nobody at this party had ever bothered to truly see. Guests who moments earlier had been laughing at Preston Hall's cruel joke now stared at Mason with an entirely different expression, the particular mixture of awe and shame that comes from realizing you mocked someone capable of saving your life. Preston himself stood frozen near the bar, his glass forgotten in his hand, unable to meet Mason's eyes even from a safe distance. Somewhere behind the stunned crowd, a phone camera had already begun recording, though Mason paid it no attention at all. His focus remained entirely on Amelia, on the faint tremor still visible in her hands, and on making certain that whatever had just happened was truly, completely over. Hotel security arrived within minutes, drawn by the sudden silence spreading across the rooftop, and found Jason, Ryan, and Hunter subdued on the tile, one still clutching a wrist that would not bend correctly for weeks. Amelia, recovering her voice at last, ordered the 3 men held and the police called before anyone could suggest otherwise. As officers began separating witnesses for statements, Mason knelt briefly beside the fallen tablet Jason had dropped, careful not to touch it directly, and pointed it out to the responding officer with a calm word about fingerprints and evidence, rather than instinct alone. It was Mason, not the hotel's own investigators, who first noticed the small inconsistencies that would unravel the entire plan. He mentioned, quietly and without accusation, that the 2 security guards normally posted near the terrace exit had been absent for at least 20 minutes before the confrontation began, an unusual gap for a private event of this size. He noted that the service door behind the bar had somehow locked itself despite functioning normally all evening, and that the Rooftop's camera feed, when checked, showed a suspicious 2-minute gap beginning at almost the exact moment the 3 men had begun closing in around Amelia. Amelia listened to each observation with a growing uneasy clarity. She had trusted Connor with the details of this event, had trusted him for 3 years with far more sensitive matters than a guest list, and the pattern Mason described pointed towards someone with intimate knowledge of the terrace's security systems, someone who could redirect guards and disable cameras without raising immediate suspicion. Her eyes found Connor across the rooftop, and for the first time all evening, she studied his face the way she studied a balance sheet that did not add up. Connor, sensing the shift in her attention, moved quickly to redirect it. "This man attacked 3 guests without provocation," he said loudly enough for the gathering officers to hear, gesturing toward Mason with practiced outrage. "I saw the whole thing. He should be the one in handcuffs, not standing here giving out theories about cameras." Several nearby guests, eager to align themselves with anyone claiming authority, murmured agreement, and for a moment the tide of the room threatened to turn against the very man who had just prevented a company from being stolen at gunpoint of intention, if not literal weapons. Amelia felt something harden in her chest, a resolve she had not expected to find so quickly after nearly losing everything. She stepped forward, placing herself deliberately between Mason and the murmuring crowd, and spoke with the same commanding clarity she used to close deals worth more money than most of the guests present would see in a lifetime. "This man saved my life tonight," she said, loud enough for the entire terrace to hear. "If anyone deserves scrutiny, it is whoever emptied this terrace of security in the exact minutes I needed it most." The silence that followed was different from the one after Mason's fight. This one belonged entirely to Connor Blake. In the days that followed, while police investigated the attempted assault and hotel management scrambled to manage the fallout, Amelia found herself unable to stop thinking about the man in the red uniform who had moved with the precision of someone trained far beyond what any lifeguard certification required. She made a few careful inquiries, not out of suspicion but out of a need to understand who had stepped into danger for a stranger, without a moment's hesitation. What she learned reshaped everything she thought she knew about him. Mason Carter had once served in a specialized tactical rescue unit, the kind of role that rarely appeared in any public record and even more rarely came up in casual conversation. He had spent years responding to situations most people would spend a lifetime trying to avoid even hearing about, and he had done so with a quiet competence that earned him respect from men who did not give respect easily. Then, 4 years ago, a family emergency had pulled him away from that life entirely, and he had chosen, deliberately and without regret, to disappear into something smaller and safer, a job where the greatest daily risk was a child swimming too far from the shallow end. He had never told his new coworkers about that former life, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he had learned that people treated him differently once they knew, and different was the last thing he wanted. He needed a schedule that let him pick up his daughter from school most afternoons. He needed a job that did not follow him home in his sleep the way his old one sometimes still did. The lifeguard uniform was not a step down from something greater. It was a choice, made deliberately, to build an ordinary life around the one person who mattered most to him now. Amelia found herself sitting with this information for a long time, turning it over the way she might turn over an unexpected clause buried in a contract. She thought of Preston Hall's cruel joke on the rooftop, of her own failure to intervene, of how easily she and everyone around her had mistaken quiet dignity for weakness simply because it came wrapped in a uniform instead of a suit. She thought about how much courage it must take to walk away from being needed for something extraordinary in order to be reliably present for something small and daily instead. When she finally sought Mason out again, it was not as the CEO addressing an employee, but as a woman genuinely curious about a man she had misjudged. Their conversation was brief and unpolished, neither of them fully at ease with the shift in how they now saw each other, but something honest passed between them in it, Amelia realized, with something like quiet astonishment, that the loneliness she had spent years managing like a line item on a balance sheet had just been recognized, without a single word about it spoken aloud, by a man who understood exactly what it cost to carry weight no one else could see. Connor Blake understood, faster than most people would have in his position, that the walls were closing in around him. The missing security guards could be explained away with paperwork and confusion, but the locked service door and the conveniently blank 2 minutes of camera footage were harder to dismiss, and he knew that any serious investigation would eventually trace both back to credentials only he possessed. Rather than wait for that reckoning, he decided to strike first, choosing the one target he believed the board would sacrifice without much resistance. Within a week, a story began circulating among select board members, carefully seeded by Connor through an anonymous source that was, in truth, simply himself using a second phone. The story claimed that Mason Carter had a documented history of unprovoked violence, that his tactical background made him dangerous rather than heroic, and that his real motive that night had been to stage a rescue for the express purpose of extorting a permanent position and a payout from the hotel afterward. It was a clever lie precisely because it took something true, Mason's skill and his silence about his past, and twisted both into evidence of guilt rather than restraint. The board, already rattled by the near loss of company control and eager for a tidy narrative that required no further scrutiny of their own security failures, responded with predictable panic. Pressure mounted on Amelia within days to quietly terminate Mason's employment and issue a statement praising hotel security broadly without naming any individual, a plan that would leave Connor entirely unexamined while erasing the one person who had actually prevented disaster. Amelia found herself in closed-door meetings defending a man half the room had already decided to believe the worst about. Mason, sensing the shape of what was coming before Amelia even told him directly, made a decision of his own. He requested a private meeting and told her plainly that he intended to resign, not out of guilt, but because he understood exactly how these situations unfolded for men who did not have lawyers or public relations teams standing behind them. He did not want his presence to become the reason her fragile hold on the company slipped further, and he told her so without bitterness, the same calm acceptance he brought to every difficult truth. Amelia listened to him, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt something in herself refuse to accept the easy, convenient path. She had spent a decade learning to sacrifice comfort for the sake of the company's survival, and she was not willing to sacrifice the one person who had proven without hesitation that he would put himself between her and real danger. "You're not resigning," she told him, quiet but immovable, "and you're not being fired either. I intend to find out exactly what happened on that rooftop, and I intend to make sure everyone in that boardroom hears it in detail." Mason studied her for a long moment, searching her face for the doubt he expected to find there, and found none. "Why fight for me on this?" he asked quietly, "when it would be so much easier for you to just let it go and move on?" Amelia considered the question longer than he expected, choosing her words the way she chose language for a contract she intended to honor completely. "Because the easy path already cost me almost everything once," she said. "I'm not making that mistake twice, and I'm certainly not making it with the one person who never once asked me for anything in return." Mason had no answer for that, and for once he did not try to find one. Amelia called an emergency session of the full board, inviting hotel security leadership, the company's legal counsel, and, over the objections of 2 board members who considered it beneath the dignity of the meeting, Mason Carter himself, the room was tense before anyone spoke, the kind of silence that came from too many people already having decided what they wanted outcome to be. Connor sat near the far end of the table, composed, confident, believing his version of events had already won the room days before this meeting even began. Mason spoke first, and he spoke the way he had approached the confrontation at the pool, without theatrics, laying out facts in the order they had occurred. He described the 2 security guards pulled from the terrace under a manufactured pretext, the service door locked from a system that required administrative access, and the 2-minute gap in camera coverage that began at the precise moment the 3 attackers closed in on Amelia. He did not accuse Connor by name. He simply presented the sequence and let the room's own understanding of the security architecture draw the obvious conclusion. The company's technical team, at Amelia's earlier instruction, had spent the preceding days quietly recovering data that Connor believed had been permanently erased. A forensic analyst placed a laptop on the table and displayed the restored footage along with system logs showing the administrative credentials used to disable the cameras and lock the door. The credentials belonged to Connor Blake, time-stamped only minutes before the attack began, alongside a series of deleted messages between his account and a burner number later traced to Jason Vale's phone, arranging payment in exchange for exactly the access he had provided. Connor's composure finally broke. He began speaking rapidly, first denying the evidence outright, then shifting to claims that he had been coerced, then finally falling silent as it became clear that no version of events remaining to him would survive the documentation laid out before the board. Security escorted him from the building within the hour, and within days formal charges followed, alongside charges against Jason, Ryan, and Hunter for conspiracy, attempted extortion, and assault. The board vote that had once threatened to strip Amelia of her company instead consolidated firmly behind her, chastened by how close negligence in their own security had come to costing them everything. Amelia stood before them once the vote was finalized and spoke plainly about the man who had made this outcome possible, praising not his old tactical training but the discipline and quiet integrity that had led him to walk toward danger with nothing to gain from it personally. Mason sat near the back of the room, uncomfortable with the attention, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to simply accept it rather than deflect it entirely. Outside the boardroom, word of what had happened spread quickly through the hotel's staff, from the front desk to the kitchens to the valets who had once barely acknowledged the quiet Lifeguard passing through the lobby each morning. Cowworkers who had never learned his last name now greeted him by it, and a few offered quiet apologies for jokes they had laughed along with months earlier without ever meaning real harm. Mason accepted each one graciously, without bitterness, understanding that most people had simply never been given a reason to look closer, and that being overlooked had never been the same thing as being unworthy of notice. Several weeks later, the rooftop pool reopened under a very different atmosphere than the tense, glittering evening that had nearly ended in disaster. The water moved calmly under the afternoon sun, undisturbed by the memory of what had happened at its edge, and the hotel had quietly reinforced its security systems in ways that would prevent any repetition of the failures that once let 3 strangers walk unchallenged into a private event. Amelia visited the terrace often now, sometimes simply to sit and watch the water without the weight of a company crisis pressing on her shoulders. She was in small but noticeable ways a different person than the woman who had once treated her own loneliness like an inconvenient line item to be managed and hidden. She still ran Langford Holdings with the same sharp discipline that had built its success, but she had begun letting people closer than she once allowed, trusting her instincts about character rather than credentials alone. She had learned, in the most frightening way possible, that competence and kindness were not opposites, and that the people worth trusting were rarely the ones who announced their own importance the loudest. Mason had been offered the position of head of hotel safety, a role with a substantial increase in both salary and responsibility, and he had accepted it only after negotiating terms that mattered more to him than the title itself. He asked to keep his schedule flexible enough to pick up his daughter most afternoons. He asked not to be paraded before the press or turned into a marketing story about hidden heroes, preferring instead to do the work quietly and let the results speak for themselves. Amelia agreed to every condition without hesitation, understanding by now exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. One evening, as the rooftop emptied of its usual guests and the pool lights flickered on against the gathering dusk, Amelia found Mason checking the same water he had watched over for 8 months before anyone bothered to learn his name. She approached without the practiced formality she once used with employees and sat down near the edge where the confrontation had once nearly cost her everything. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said. "Not just for that night. For reminding me what it actually looks like when someone means what they say." Mason considered this for a moment, the way he considered most things, carefully and without rushing toward an easy answer. "You would have found your footing eventually," he said. "You're not someone who stays down for long." She smiled at that, the first unguarded smile he had seen from her since the night they met, and for a while neither of them said anything else, content simply to sit together at the water's edge as the city lights came up one by one across the bay. Neither rushed to name what was beginning between them, but both understood, without needing the words, that two people who had spent years being strong entirely alone had quietly, carefully, begun learning how to stop. There was no dramatic declaration that evening, no sweeping promise made beneath the string lights, only the small, steady comfort of two people choosing to sit beside each other instead of facing their separate burdens apart. Amelia would return the next morning to a company finally stable enough to breathe, and Mason would return to his daughter with a story he might in time decide to tell her. For now, it was enough that the water stayed calm, the lights stayed warm, and neither of them felt any particular need to rush toward whatever came next. Some people spend their whole lives being underestimated, standing quietly at the edge of rooms that never bother to learn their names. This was a story about what happens when that quiet is mistaken for weakness, and about the courage it takes to step forward anyway, expecting nothing in return. Mason never wanted recognition. He wanted a safe, ordinary life for his daughter, and he found something more than that along the way, a woman who finally learned to see people clearly instead of by title or uniform. If this story moved you, think for a moment about the quiet people in your own life, the ones who rarely ask for credit but would step forward without hesitation if it mattered. They deserve to be noticed long before a crisis ever forces the truth into the open.